At 2 in the morning, in a river rather than an ocean, a passenger liner carrying 1,477 people was torn open in the fog. 14 minutes later, the Empress of Ireland was gone. 1,012 people died. Many of them were still inside the ship. Rescue was close. The shore was close. The wreck still lies off St. Luce today, at about 45 meters, tilted on its starboard side, largely intact. So why did the largest single maritime loss in Canadian history become a story most people barely know? The Empress of Ireland did not disappear from the river. It disappeared from public memory. What remained was harder to ignore. A protected wreck, a list of names, memorial services, and one unresolved trace in an archive. This episode follows what those things contain and why the gap between the evidence and the memory is the real story. Among those who survived was a 7-year-old girl named Grace Hannigan. Her father, Edward James Hannigan, was the staff bandmaster of the Canadian Salvation Army. Her mother was traveling with them. The whole family had boarded the ship together in Quebec after a public send-off in Toronto that had the shape of a celebration. Uniforms, music, a march down Yonge Street, and a train east to catch an ocean liner. Grace came up from the river. Her parents did not. Keep Grace in view through this episode. The records will become technical. She is one reason they matter. Before she was a wreck, the Empress of Ireland was part of a transportation system that treated the St. Lawrence as the front door of the Atlantic. She was built in 1906, a Canadian Pacific liner running a regular route from Quebec to Liverpool. The St. Lawrence was not an exotic passage. It was an artery. Mail, emigrants, business travelers, and returning families moved along it as a matter of routine. Parks Canada now values the wreck as a rare surviving structure from early 20th century passenger ship design. In 1914, she was a timetable, a ticket, and a route home. That distinction matters. The Empress was not outside the system. She was the system working as intended, right up until it stopped. The Salvation Army contingent aboard that sailing numbered about 150 people. They were traveling to the International Congress in London, the largest gathering the organization held. They were not a random cluster of passengers who happened to share a deck. They were officers, musicians, spouses, and children who had worked alongside each other for years. For the Army in Canada, they were leadership, families, musicians, and friends. The public send-off in Toronto reflected that. This was not a quiet departure. It was a march, a crowd, a band, and then a train east. Grace Hannigan was 7 years old in that procession, alongside her father, who was responsible for keeping 29 musicians in time. That band marched down Yonge Street. 29 of its members did not come back. The fatal assumption was not that the ship was unsafe. Ships in 1914 carried lifeboats. They carried them because the absence of lifeboats had already become impossible to defend publicly. The Empress was, by the standards of the day, a responsibly provisioned vessel. The assumption was specific, that any emergency would give people time to use what was carried aboard. Empress did not fail over hours. She failed in minutes. 14 minutes is often used as the whole story of this disaster. It is not the story. It is the limit placed on everyone inside it. The number explains why a ship with adequate lifeboat capacity still produced more than 1,000 dead. 14 minutes is not enough time to wake sleeping passengers, locate exits, reach open air, and find a working boat. It is enough time for a ship to go from a viable emergency to a wreck on the riverbed, with people still inside it. This was not mid-ocean. The wreck lies in the St. Lawrence, off St. Luce. The river here is wide, but it is a river. Pilot stations and shore communities knew the traffic. The route from Quebec to Liverpool begins in water that looks, from the bank, like a working corridor. Mail exchanged, schedules posted, the ship's familiar. That nearness is part of the discomfort. The disaster did not happen somewhere unreachable. It happened in a place close enough that rescue seemed plausible, and fast enough that plausibility did not translate into survival. Rescue was close, but the disaster was faster. By the evening of 28 May 1914, the send-off had become a sailing. The train, the parade, and the music were behind them. Empress of Ireland cleared Quebec and moved downstream. The crew had run this route before. The water was familiar. The weather gave no obvious warning. For Grace Hannigan, the ship was probably the largest enclosed space she had been in. For her father, it was a working crossing, the kind of passage a professional accounts for in a logbook and then mostly forgets. Neither of them went to sleep knowing what the river would do before morning. In the early hours of 29th May, fog closed around two ships moving through the same stretch of river in opposite directions. The Empress was outbound. The Storstad was a Norwegian collier, a cargo vessel carrying coal, moving upstream. The St. Lawrence fog is not a narrative device. It is a documented, recurring condition in that stretch of water. Both vessels were operating in conditions that crews on that route had navigated before. The records show that the Storstad drove into the starboard side of the Empress. What the records do not settle is the precise sequence of navigational decisions that put both ships on the same line. The Quebec Heritage record notes that both vessels made errors without naming a single culprit. Later summaries often compress the inquiry into a simpler sentence, assigning primary fault to the Storstad and its captain. Until the full inquiry report is read page by page, the honest narration is not case closed. It is. The record has been summarized in competing ways. What is not in dispute is what the collision produced. The Storstad opened a wound in the Empress's starboard side, and what followed was less a sinking sequence than a collapse of time. The survival pattern was not random. People awake, near open air, or already moving, had chances that sleeping passengers below did not. The collision came at approximately 2 in the morning. Most third-class passengers were asleep in lower berths on the starboard side, the side that took the impact. The ship listed rapidly. The port-side lifeboats became unusable before they could be launched. The mathematics worked against the lower decks almost immediately. The records let us say that much. They do not let us narrate every cabin. Between the collision and the riverbed is the part no inquiry could fully reconstruct. Most of the people who could have described it did not survive. Grace Hannigan came back up. Her parents did not. That is the kind of sentence a passenger list can hold without explaining it. The records confirm she was recovered from the river. They do not say how, or who pulled her out, or what she understood of those early morning hours. 7 years old in a river in the dark is not a narrative the record was built to hold. She survived. The record holds that fact, and then it stops. The Salvation Army lost 124 of its 150 travelers. Among the dead were 29 members of the Canadian Staff Band, the musicians who had marched down Yonge Street 10 days earlier. The band was not an abstract institutional asset. It was 29 specific people whose work was to keep a traveling community in time. The Army in Canada was not large enough that losing 24 experienced musicians was simply a personnel matter. It was a rupture in the connective tissue of a young national movement. The band had to be rebuilt by the living. Not everybody came back with a name. The recovery operation worked within the limits of 1914 identification practice. Some of the dead were identified. Others were buried as unknown. Others were not recovered. The river returned what it chose to return, and the families waited for information that arrived unevenly and incompletely. The death toll of 1,012 people does not require elaboration. What it requires is the acknowledgement that each of those people had a specific and irrecoverable experience, and the record gives us almost none of them. The wreck did not scatter. A ship is built to move. A wreck is evidence because it cannot. Empress came to rest on the riverbed off St. Luce, and the St. Lawrence became the archive no one could close. The hull stayed coherent. The cargo remained. The equipment remained. Personal effects belonging to more than 1,000 people remained, distributed through the interior of a vessel that had become, in 14 minutes, a sealed space at the bottom of a river. The Quebec Heritage Register classified the site in 1999. Parks Canada designated it a National Historic Site in 2009, more than 90 years after the sinking. Parks Canada identifies it as Canada's most complete surviving structural example of an early 20th century passenger vessel. That assessment is archaeological, not sentimental. The ship sank fast enough and deeply enough that it did not deteriorate the way a surface wreck deteriorates. The engines are still there. The hull configuration is still there. The physical dimensions of the spaces where people died are still there, off St. Luce at 45 meters. The later designations mattered because they converted curiosity into custody. The wreck is now protected rather than available for salvage. That is a decision about what the evidence is worth. The Canadian Museum of History holds a sound recording related to the Empress collection. One analog reel, 7 inches across, assigned accession numbers in the catalog. What the reel contains, who made it, and when, are questions the catalog entry does not answer. That gap is its own kind of evidence, not of what happened, but of the limits of what the archive can currently confirm. The disaster entered the archive as sound, not only as steel. That fact stands. The rest remains open. When public attention moved elsewhere, memorial practice continued. The annual May service at Mount Pleasant Cemetery did not begin after the disaster and fade when interest did. It continued through the years when the war had pushed the Empress out of public conversation, through the decades when the wreck sat undesignated on the riverbed, through the long period when Canadian maritime history was largely Titanic adjacent in popular understanding. A service repeated every May is not an argument. It is an archive made of people returning. Several modern retellings make the Empress legible by calling it a national version of a better-known liner disaster. That framing helps a new audience place the scale. It also shrinks what the record is actually asking. The comparison is not wrong in every particular. Both disasters expose the limits of maritime safety assumptions. Both involved a vessel thought to be prepared for emergency, and both became attached to questions about lifeboats, regulation, and public memory. The overlaps are real, but the record here is not asking for a comparison. It is asking why a wreck this intact, with a death toll this high, became a secondary memory. The answer has nothing to do with a ship that sank in the North Atlantic 2 years earlier. It has to do with timing. The obscurity of the Empress is not evidence of smallness. It is evidence of timing. 1,012 people died in the St. Lawrence on 29 May 1914. That number is the largest single maritime loss in Canadian history. 2 months later, the First World War began. 1,000 deaths can still be made quiet if history finds a louder room. The war did not erase the Empress. It replaced the frame through which events were understood. The question people were asking by August 1914 was not about riverine safety or the findings of a maritime inquiry. After 4 years of that question, the habits of memory had reorganized around a different catastrophe entirely. The Empress was not forgotten because the record was thin. She was forgotten because the world found a larger catastrophe 2 months later. The evidence stayed: wreck, inquiry, memorial, archive, names. The Parks Canada designation in 2009 was not a discovery. It was a formal acknowledgement that the evidence had been there the whole time. The Quebec classification in 1999 was the same kind of acknowledgement. The annual service at Mount Pleasant was an acknowledgement made in person, by people who knew the names on the plaque. The wreck off St. Luce was the largest acknowledgement of all, made in iron and water, available to anyone who could descend to 45 meters. None of it disappeared. It was the attention that moved, not the record. Years later, Grace Hannigan was still connected to the memorial at Mount Pleasant, where the Salvation Army dead were named each May. She had come up from the river at 7 years old. She had grown up without her parents. She had grown up alongside an institutional memory that the Army maintained formally, in uniform, each spring at a cemetery in Toronto. The record does not say what that practice meant to her specifically. It says she remained tied to it. It says the practice continued. At Mount Pleasant, the wreath is not an explanation. It is a small act of memory for a ship the river never gave back.